everybody. Rita McGrath here. A pleasure to welcome you to a Friday conversation, which we are in the process of rebranding as Thought Sparks. I'm absolutely delighted to be introducing my guest this week, which is Matt Beane, who is a Thinkers 50 Radar nominee, a TED talker, let me just make sure I've got this right, assistant professor of the technology management program at the University of California, Santa Barbara, a digital fellow at Stanford University, a liaison at MIT, and many, many, many other things. But for our purposes, what we're mainly going to be talking about is his terrific book called Skill Code, which to me gets at one of the really critical issues of our time, which is how do we, in an age of increasingly advanced technologies, preserve that essentially human ability to learn and to develop new skills at doing increasingly complex and challenging things. So welcome, Matt.
I am delighted to be here, Rita. Really was thrilled to get the invite, and so look forward to the conversation.
Well, I'm delighted to have you, and I really enjoyed digging into your book, which I think gets it at some really existential questions now, in the age of many, many advanced technologies, robotics and AI being two that are particularly germane. So I know you've been probing this topic for a long time. You've done hundreds of interviews. You talk with great empathy about the teams that you watch, the people that you've observed, the kinds of interactions between workers and their environment that you've seen over many years now. And what finally crystallized this into book form for you?
Let's see. I think I got off the TED stage, which getting that invite to do that so early in my academic career was a bit of a shock. I had published an academic paper on the difference between how people were learning how to do traditional surgery and robotic surgery. That was sort of the core study that I did as part of my dissertation while I was at MIT. That really sort of, you can hear the echoes of that through all the rest of my work moving forward. That led to a Harvard Business Review article invite and simultaneously an invite to stand on the TED stage. And so I managed to get through that experience and got an email from a good friend and mentor, Andy McAfee, who's at MIT.
Oh, sure.
He just sent me an email, and it was, I believe, 4 words, and it was, "So, when's the book?"
And I just met him. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, I was at an AI conference at MIT, and he was the closing keynote speaker.
He's brilliant, and I have known him since I started as a doctoral student there, and sort of helped him and Eric Brynjolfsson on the work underlying their second machine age book. Anyway, so I had other people telling me, in no universe should you write a book, Matt. That is a wildly inappropriate thing to do, and so on. And I tend to respond with more creative and productive energy to a no than a yes. So I had a few people I really respect say, "Don't you dare," and that helped move me along almost as much as Andy's just stunning suggestion. I had the idea rattling around in my head. I'd say the main theoretical impetus, or the sort of I was trying to be as helpful as I could with my research. And what I realized is that I left it as an exercise to the reader. With all my research, I'd done many studies by the time that I started to work on this book, to figure out what core principles they could cotton onto if they, in their local context, wanted to try to figure out, is skill development in healthy supply here? Is it, can I count on this set of work conditions to drive my skill development moving forward? And I just really hadn't supplied that. My academic work really didn't sort of take a step back and pull it all together into a coherent picture. And I believe that we had an urgent problem on our hands in terms of that basic engine for skill development being healthy in our economy now, sort of a self-inflicted wound. And that's the core motivation, really, to a sort of an act, if you think of it as an act of service, which I mostly did most of the time, is I've got to take a year and a half or so, try to pull this together into a user-friendly, context agnostic, apply it in any profession, any business, any industry, any technology kind of a way. Anyway, that times Andy's email times some people say, don't you dare.
I love it. I love it. Well, I find and it's ironic in the context of talking about skill development, but I find writing a book for me is really a skill building act, and you talk
Yes.
about the elements of building skill as sort of challenge, right? So you've got to overcome some kind of difficulty, and then complexity, learning how the pieces of a system fit together. And then this notion of it's not an individual act, it's often a collective act. So the idea of connection. So for those of you just joining us, I'm here with Matt Beane. We are talking about his terrific book called The Skill Code, which is really looking at, where do we find the humanity in so much of the automated world that we're living in right now. So maybe walk us through those three things, the challenge, the complexity, the connection as elements of building skill, because I had not in the previously really thought about those as connected things.
Right. Neither had I. So the book was this great luxury of trying to look at between, say, 90 and 100 years worth of research on how human beings learn stuff. I, of course, am more focused on the workplace and how people learn at work. But looking at all of that research times what it was that was allowing people to build skill in the face of incredible barriers at work using robots and AI and so on. I sort of pulling that all together. I ended up with sort of three areas of focus or sort of conditions that were important. There are various theories that link these kinds of things together in sequences. For instance, you have to have a bit of this first, then you have this kind of a moment for your learning, and then you close out and you end up with mastery here. None of those theories really match this dizzying world. It's increasingly fractured that we live in, digital, distanced, and so on. They sometimes are useful. I tried to build one of those for this book, and I realized the higher active service was just to give the alphabet, so to speak, or the atomic units of skill development at work. The first of them is challenge, and that's summed up in a phrase: working close to but not at the edge of your capacity. And that does not feel fun. It is not a relaxing space to be in. You are not performing as well as you ordinarily could in ideal conditions, and so on. And so in that chapter, I sort of articulate how would what are the 10, and for each of these 3 C's in this book, I articulate 10 a checklist of 10 work-related conditions that you could look at to assess, do I have healthy challenge at work right now? But bottom line, if you're in that spot, you're learning, and it will not be fun in any traditional sense of the word. The next one, as you mentioned, is complexity, which is, we often think of building skill as getting good at something. So I mentioned I studied surgery and robotic surgeons and so on. That's tying a knot, for instance, or making a safe incision. That's a focal skill, and that's not false. It's true. At the same time, becoming a good surgeon involves being aware as you do the act, as you begin to build this focal skill, looking left, looking right, and understand the ecosystem of activities, roles, systems, processes, and values, and so on that you're embedded in, so that you can better predict and understand surprise. So a really good surgeon knows how much instruments cost on the table over there. They know how the supply chain inside the hospital works. They know about the finances of the institution. They know about the roles, responsibilities, and sort of orienting model of a nurse or a scrub tech. They're digesting the entire system. And not only is that necessary for you to be able to predict surprise, but it also helps you pick your next career trajectory moment. Like, am I more interested in going over here or over there? So that's the complexity bit. It's also important as part of that contending with complexity to reflect and take space and time, sometimes consciously, sometimes not, just to process the learning that you've gone through. And then the last one that it turns out is resonating most strongly with every audience I talk to is connection. We don't often think of, which is defined simply as a warm bond of trust and respect between human beings. And we don't often think of that as related to or required for healthy skill development. But the research is really, this is not just my research. I mean, across many disciplines, it's very, very clear that your skill development, it will be far better if you have a high quality bond of trust and respect, typically with somebody who knows more, who has some more expertise. These don't have to be long lived. They can be very brief. But the point is that bond provides two things that are crucial. One is it provides access. If the person you want, who has more expertise than you doesn't trust and respect you to some degree, they're not even going to give you a chance to play. So you won't even get the work opportunity you need to learn by doing, so to speak. But the other part is motivation. So it's interesting. I sort of, in the book, I think more about the motivation of the junior learner, the novice, trying to build skill. And they want to earn the trust and respect of that senior person. I can tell you, the way I built skill in my career is much less about a how than a who. Like, I could name names of people that I looked up to, and I said, by God, I am going to make sure that they say, yeah, that was a pretty good job by the end of today. But it turns out the research is very clear that that's bi-directional too. People in senior roles, expert roles, deeply value, especially later in their careers, earning the trust and respect of the next generation coming up and helping them along, helping get them further, faster, farther than they might have even thought possible, and then crowing about them to others, right? This is a part of what makes you feel like, look at this incredible person who's eclipsed even me, that I had a small hand in mentoring. This is like part of what makes the human journey worth it. So in a way, skill is more about the meaning in our lives than our capabilities to affect outcomes. Anyway, I could go on and on about connection. I think that's especially these days in this digital distanced world of work we live in.
Oh yeah, and I think there's huge implications. But maybe bring those things to life with. I love one of your opening stories about Kristen, the young aspiring resident surgeon.
Sure.
In the two worlds, she kind of occupies the sort of before robotic automation and after.
Yes. So at the beginning of a surgical rotation, Kristen might walk in at 6:30 in the morning into an operating room with a patient on a gurney. And for the first 45 minutes of that procedure, the senior surgeon is not in that room. She and the team put the patient under. She leads the initial 8-inch incision in the lower abdomen and gets it clamped back to do whatever kind of procedure. Let's say it's a prostatectomy that day. Once that's ready to go, she calls the attending. The attending arrives, gowns up, and from there on in, their four hands are mostly in that patient, with him guiding, but Kristen leading the way. Exactly right.
Together. I mean, they're
exactly. They are shoulder to shoulder, standing next to that patient or across the patient, working together to get the work done. So the procedure, a good prostatectomy takes about 4.5 hours. Wow. So for that 4.5 hours, Kristen is on task the entire time, incredibly focused. And if she's lucky at the end, she's got a junior resident looking over her shoulder, and she even lets them do the final line of sutures. So the chain of learning gets sort of passed on, and she's moving up. By contrast, and I saw this across 18 of the top teaching hospitals in the US, I did for 2.5 years. I was in the operating room in places like this. Robotic surgery is a very different practice. Kristen would wheel the patient in, and the attending would arrive at the same time. They would together attach a 4-armed 1,000-pound robot to that patient through keyhole incisions. They would rip off their scrubs, head to 2 separate control consoles to control that robot. Kristen would sit down at that control console, typically, fold her arms, and watch for 3.5 hours. If she's lucky, on average, she'd operate for, say, between 10 and 15 minutes during a very straightforward and safe part of the procedure. So she has no hope of doing anything complicated during that rotation. And she'll be lucky if she walks away feeling like she's not going to hurt someone with the tool. I know that sounds dramatic, but since I did that research. And this was quite a stunning thing for me to witness up close and personal. A number of news organizations, U.S. News and World Report, IEEE Spectrum, Wired Magazine, have gone and done independent reporting on this, and it is still true today, unfortunately. I did my study in 2014, 2015, and so in 2022 was the last double check on all this. It is unchanged. Most residents just don't get to touch the patient. And the reason is, and this is endemic in our economy, and this is the threat that woke me up to the cause for doing multiple research projects and then eventually writing a book, is that the new tool, the robotic surgical device, makes it possible for that expert to do the entire job themselves. And so they will, and they do, because they are more efficient and quality is higher. Anytime, and involving a novice now is an act of willful interruption to that efficiency flow. When's the right time, I would ask a surgeon, to involve a novice in the procedure knowing that they will make more mistakes and be slower? The answer is never. Never is the correct time. And I am now seeing this in law, in bomb disposal, in software development, you name it, HR, even in executive development. There are key moments where once upon a time, without ChatGPT, I needed to involve someone else to get the work done, and they learned because they were involved with me in solving a complicated problem. Now I can eat the whole problem by myself 5 times faster, and I don't have to phone that person in. That's an existential threat, I think, to this taken for granted engine of this expert novice relationship at work. And it's hard to notice. No party has a real strong incentive to see this. The productivity gains from all these technologies, the robotic surgical device, for instance, is so stark and immediate. It is dramatically less violent to the patient. The patient recovery is much faster. The pain is much less. You can be much more precise as you operate and so on. It's much kinder to the surgeon's body. Like, there's all these immediate productivity benefits. And the novice doesn't even really know to complain because they're new to this game too. They don't know that once upon a time I could learn shoulder to shoulder with you. Some of them do. Some of them figured that out. But in short, Kristen's story of sort of this stark contrast between collaborative problem solving with someone who knows more versus novice optional is what I'm now calling this. I'm seeing that ramifying throughout the economy.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. There was a fascinating study that was done, and it feeds into this whole return to office, work from home, whatever thing, which I would love to get your views on. But there was a study that was recently done with a group of researchers, and they had the good fortune of a naturally occurring experiment, which was they were studying communication patterns among programmers in a major high-tech firm. I imagine it's one of the GAFA firms, it wasn't named in the study, but they studied the patterns of communication among software coders in a building. Before and after the pandemic. So before, obviously, they were all there together, and during the pandemic. And what they found was a fascinating pattern where the people that were more senior reported much higher productivity when they were out of the building, when they were working at home. And it's exactly as you say. I didn't get interrupted. People didn't mess with my work. I didn't get pulled off onto side tasks. The junior people, much less productivity when they were separate, and much less mentoring, much less kind of guidance, much less feedback on their projects. And what I loved about that study was that both the people that say I'm more productive when I'm not in the office, and the people that say, yeah, but we need mentoring and we need skill building and we need community building, they're both right. Depending on what time period you're looking at, right? And the implication, though, was yes, in the sort of immediate period, for the senior people, this was like nirvana, right? I much less hassle, much more productive, got my stuff done, but you're not planting the seeds for the future. And I think it's very evocative of what you've discovered as well, which is, doing all that training and mentoring and bringing along does have a cost if you're the expert. Now, it has benefits too, and I wouldn't deny that. But in the near term, if your main objective is get this output accomplished, yeah, it does take away from that goal.
Yeah, no, and I'll just take this straight to home. I am aware of a few studies like this, but I'll take it much closer to home. So during COVID, for instance, I was dramatically more productive as a researcher. and as a writer. In fact, I wrote this book. It was an enforced kind of monastic experience for me, and I reveled in it. It was marvelous. And I was doing subtle, significant, and steady violence to the doctoral students in my program. Now, I've tried to compensate for that, but how often did I go into the office and just hang out with them, chat with them about their research and so on? It was a willful act. And so I am myself enacting the very dynamic that I've found in my research, and I understand it up close and personal. It's very tempting because you can race ahead further, faster with deeper problems if you can get focus. Also now, the intelligent technologies we're hurling into the equation just amplify that. If you use them even reasonably well, you're going to be more productive. You're going to get at the interesting bits of your work faster and so on. I can't tell you the amount of inbound email traffic I have from deans at big academic institutions, people who have read my papers and so on, saying, I have a son, a daughter working at some consulting firm or investment bank or some firm in New York or something, and they can't find a mentor to save their life. It's almost verbatim across numerous worried parents. And there are many managers in these organizations. They're just not available. So the traditional assumed solution for skill development at work is training. Organizations invest, say, $500 billion a year globally in training to help people build skill at work. The research shows very unequivocally that training is very ineffective at building skill, which I define as the ability to reliably produce valuable behavior under pressure.
I love that definition.
Right?
Yeah.
So that doesn't come from a book or from training. Awareness, knowledge is typically the product of training, and the half-life of that knowledge is pretty short. You tend to lose it unless you apply it and so on. But the skill, the ability to show up, make sense of a complicated problem, and act in a useful way during the welter of the problem and so on, that the research has been clear since the 70s at least. We've had this sort of 70, 20, 10 orientation, like most of what you learn that's valuable, you learn by doing. That's a really old adage. That's sort of core to this book. But we take for granted the mechanism inside that. The mechanism inside that is this. It can be short-lived. You don't even have to name it. But the connection between an expert and a novice as they work together on a problem is the engine that drives that 70%. Organizations don't invest in it. They don't understand it. They don't name it. They don't see it, with rare exceptions. And now we're breaking that thing subtly and slowly. So it's kind of the worst moment to be doing it. And it's optional. I think we can do better and differently. But that's the middle third of this book, sort of identifying that hidden and subtle threat to this taken for granted, really critical engine for skill development.
Well, and I think so let's dive into the whole hybrid, return to office thing. So I was chatting with Keith Ferrazzi. You probably know him. He's a big expert on networking and how that flows into other aspects of your life. And he did a bunch of research with his team. He studies thousands of teams and say on a 5-point scale of kind of teamness, where the question would be something like, I believe my team has my back. Right. And what he found was prior to the pandemic, the typical team scored on a 5-point scale about 2.8, which is not awesome. I mean, when you think about it, and he calls that's the output of serendipitous bonding. Yeah. And then during the pandemic, it fell to about 2.2, 2.3. And so when senior leaders say, return to office, I want everybody here, we're going to measure your badge swipes and all that stuff. What they're basically saying is, I'm hungry for a return to 2.8. But when you think about it, 2.8 is nothing to write home about. I mean, that's just what happens accidentally. And honestly, if you're going to the office and you put your headphones on and you're on Zoom screens all day long, what is the point of being there? So there's that argument, right, which says, why should I endure a commute of, the hassle, the interruptions, people making fish tacos in the microwave, whatever your particular annoyances are.
Oh, yes, been there on that one, yes.
Right. Why should I endure that? And yet what you're saying is there's a much deeper social fabric argument, but it's not just physically being in the space together. It's what are we doing in that space? Are we fostering those genuine expert novice learning interactions? And I think a lot of firms are not very good at doing that. And one of the things it makes me think of is if you think about a lot of the principles of Agile teams, where
Right.
you've got all the skills that you need in one team, you're working on one thing and you're doing it very intently over a 2-week period. What to me your research suggests is that's optimal for skill building across the team.
Right. Yes, and I would say, in theory, that is absolutely true, and it's it's a factual question on the ground in the case of every team. And my job in this book was in those first 3 chapters to give you checklists so that you can look at your Agile team or any team you're in, or even a dyadic interaction, just one-on-one, and say, are these 3 C's in healthy supply in my context? Mm-hmm. And so in Agile teams, yes, you are much more likely to have the kinds of interactions that are going to drive that, because you have a lot more collateral contact, you have different kinds of roles and expertise that are, everyone has something that's necessary for the solution, so you all have to contribute and so on. And so in principle, and also you have an urgent goal and it's short term. Humans are much better, all of us, on dealing with short, urgent problems, right? Watching coordination in the OR is really quite stunning. And this is started with elective procedures. So these are actually relatively staid and relaxed, intensive coordinated activities of, say, 4 to 6 hours, because the patient decided it was time to have this surgery and they had time to plan and so on. But then I rotated through like general surgery and the ER, places where you're doing surgery, and every single one is a surprise and you're not quite sure what you're dealing with and life is on the line. And humans are extraordinary at ensuring great collaborative patterns, and skill development is driven by that. If you have an urgent problem that requires everyone's fierce attention and complementary skill, that's a place where people are going to learn a lot. And so wonderful. The challenge there is that it won't always be so good, and everyone, I hope, will have a new set of criteria to apply those kind of circumstances and assess what could we be doing better. What is wonderful here that we should fight to preserve and scale? That's another question. But then maybe it's not, and then you can try to remediate whatever kinds of challenges you've got.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So one of the things that I thought was particularly interesting in the book is you identify this practice of shadow learning. And that's the first time I've really heard that talked about, as, people that may not even be aware that they're doing it, but they're trying to break out of this kind of de-skilling, almost Taylorist box they've been put into, and build skills some other way.
Right.
And the example of, I think, a woman who spoke Spanish on the assembly line.
Yes. Yeah. So the last stopping about 1.25 years ago, but for about almost 3 years, I led a team. Actually, I had the great privilege of getting enough funding to hire a team of researchers to scour the country to study the implementation of AI-enabled robots in warehousing and logistics and parcel types of settings. And we had the same basic questions there that I had in surgery, which is, under what conditions are individuals, teams, and organizations learning particularly well? And and usually the reason that's my sort of going in question is that we should assume with new technologies that it's not going well. Like, that's the general rule with new tech. People will struggle to be productive, but also they will struggle to learn how to become more productive, build the skill that they need. So it turns out that in warehousing, just as I found in surgery, the standard ways of implementing those technologies, putting robots on a kitting line, for instance, this is a line where workers would traditionally assemble a subscription box of, say, makeup or doggy treats or something that would go out every month to a subscriber base. There are warehouses that are set up to put together these kitted goods, and there would be workers on this line to assemble them piece by piece. They would take something out of a bag and drop it in and put it in just such a way as the box went by. When robots were implemented on those lines, the workers each ended up having to tend to 2 robots to supervise them, which you would think is great, but what it does is break the connection between all of those workers, and they stop being able to interact as much, learn from each other, and so on. And they had less contact with managers because they were more focused on this robot that they were dealing with. And so basically it meant that it was harder to move from a minimum wage line worker position into an adjacent or upward position of, say, maybe a line lead and so on, because you have less collateral exposure to the complexity of that work. Some defied norms and rules even to build skill anyway. And in surgery, I found this first, but in this kidding line, I talk about the one. This is a fictional name, and is sort of a prototypical example. But a woman named Tuya, she was a real person in a warehouse in the Baltimore, Maryland area, and she took extra time, sort of outside of approved norms for work. She sacrificed her break time to hang out with these robots, and to look at how they functioned, because basically they would supply error codes when they weren't working right, but they were in English. And she and her coworkers were from Laos and Cambodia and Thailand. They didn't speak English. They didn't know what those error codes were, and they didn't know how to solve these robotic problems. She, to the great irritation of her coworkers and managers, would just not take her breaks, and stand by these robots and try to puzzle through the logic of these error codes. Once she figured it out, she went to her line lead and told them, "Hey, look, make pictures instead of use words." That's all she could say. So they shift, and her line lead then suggested to the vendor building and piloting these robots, they instantly implemented this patentable suggestion, by the way. And all of a sudden there were iconographic representations of the errors that the robots were, and productivity in the line increased. This woman, Tuya, got no credit for that idea. Her line lead took credit. That was painful to watch. I was there when it happened. And she didn't get any pay. She didn't get fired. So she personally experienced no benefit. But what she did get out of the equation by bending and breaking all those rules is basically robotic UX expertise. Like, she now was reasonably fluent on how you design a user interface for a robot, how the robot physically functioned, and how you might change that design. You could hire her onto your UX robotics engineering team. Like, she would be a reasonable and helpful entry-level participant in that team. Could even upskill to become an engineer, possibly. Anyway, the point is, she got her skill with robotic UX for robotics by breaking and bending rules. And that was what I saw in surgery too. The only people who get ahead when you put a barrier in front of people that stops them from learning in approved ways, a very small group will break rules to build skill anyway, because that's what humans want to do. That's from Merton back in the 40s and 50s. We have social theory that shows us that, anytime there's a valued goal and you put something in the way of it, some folks are just going to break rules to get there anyway. And that's what I found with respect to skill. And so I called it shadow learning, because the people who are succeeding in building skill in this very skill building hostile environment are having to find inappropriate, not approved ways of getting there. Something that everyone would wince at if they looked at it. No one would say that's an appropriate way to get at, go about. You shouldn't have to risk getting fired to build the skills you need to do your job, but that's what these people are doing.
Yeah. Well, it also makes me think sort of across the board, if you look at theories of human motivation, like Dan Pink has popularly said, what are we motivated by? We're motivated by agency, so the ability to have some control over what we do, how we do it, when we do it, and so forth. We're motivated by mastery, which is the whole notion of building skills. How do we get better at things? I mean, how do you explain why highly paid people with very demanding jobs would give their time for free to build Linux, right? I mean, there's no other explanation for it than our hunger for mastery and community, as you pointed out, with the other people kind of out there building this hacker kind of thing. And then purpose, a sense of core purpose. And, I think what we've experienced in the workplace, and this goes all the way back to Taylor. And by the way, Taylor, to me, Frederick Taylor, the author of Scientific Management, has been vastly misunderstood. When he first started looking at time motion studies, and since then we've looked at the dark sides of Taylorism and very justly the purposes to which that's been put. But when he first started, his position was the average worker doesn't know enough about their job to do it at its best, right? So that's why an enlightened management working in partnership with the worker will discover the best way to do that job, and then we'll have the one best way. And his thesis was that meant both management and workers could thrive, because what he had experienced as a young man working on a production line was that the workers were deliberately gating how productive they would be. And so that everybody, that management would pay them and they would keep productivity low. And therefore, the management wouldn't know any better, right? And so Taylor was the first to introduce so-called scientific management into this whole. But I think what we have lost about Taylor and what we continue to miss out on is this whole, what does human motivation mean at work? How do we build skills? And I think it shows up in the engagement numbers. I mean, depending on which study you look at, anywhere between 40 and 70% of our workforce is either actively disengaged or sort of moderately meh about work. And you talk about that in the book too. You talk about, especially in warehouse workers, that eventually they just sort of become hamsters in a wheel of just never ending drudgery.
Right. Yes. And this is the dark side. I mean, the Tuya, and I refer to Beth as a prototypical surgeon who managed to build robotic skill in spite of all these barriers. These folks are the exceptions that prove the rule. And the rule is de-skilling and therefore demotivating. Dan Pink, the cornerstone of his book, and in many ways a key part of mine, is DC and Ryan's original work on self-determination theory, and that has over 2 million citations. For an academic, that's just... in no human lifetime should you ever expect that kind of attention. And I think it's really that those basic needs that we have are sort of shot through the economy. You can see the evidence of it. And when you don't get those needs met, so I talk about Eddie, another worker in basically the same building, who ended up getting turned into a bit of a robot by working on a robotic line. Right. So his range of potential activities, his discretion, his input, his understanding of the entire process, and his connections with other human beings, those 3 C's, challenge, complexity, connection, were all greatly attenuated. He became a bit of human glue in a robotic production system. And we saw this basically in many warehousing organizations of all different sizes, that people just show up and expect to go through a certain set of repetitive motions, barely talk to anybody else, and leave 8 hours later and get paid, and don't expect any meaning out of that work, aside from the dignity that it gives them to come home with a paycheck. And that is an atrocious waste of human potential. Mm-hmm. We can do so much better, and we, there are many reasons why this analogy is inappropriate. But I will say the Japanese production system, coming out of Toyota initially, but generally speaking in the Japanese business culture, and in particular manufacturing and production cultures, workers are a deeply instrumental source of real-time feedback on the health of processes. Their suggestions for how to improve and change processes are just assumed to be flowing forward and so on. The reward systems are better aligned with that kind of thing. There are other possible routes, a higher road that many of us can travel to create much, Zeynep Ton talks about good jobs, right? That research has been with us for like 3 generations now. We've known there's a higher, better route. And a good job, it just turns out, the one that's interesting, motivating, gives you a sense of purpose, all the things you're talking about, will build your skill much better, much faster than a bad job. Mm-hmm. And the challenge we have right now is that we're inadvertently creating lots of worse jobs by the way we're implementing AI and robotics, because the expert is happier, they're more productive. The firm loves that as well, because ROI. 3 to 5 years later, they're going to have this new crop of novices wash up on their shores. I talked about this in a recent Wall Street Journal article, who are not fit for duty and yet have the right titles and right job descriptions to justify their hiring. Then what are firms going to do? What are occupations going to do? Surgery's going early on this one, and it's not a pretty picture. So I think there will be a tax to be paid. It just comes with a lag. It doesn't all happen in the heat of the moment.
So one of the interesting tensions, and I do want to get to kind of remedies, but one of the interesting tensions to me is if you think about technological progress, there's this balance between, okay, so I'm not building skills at buggy whip making,
Right.
But that's a skill that's actually not going to be much needed in the future. So there's that element. And then but here are skills that might be really valuable in the future. And so economist William Baumol talks about this when he talks about incentives for innovation or not in an economy. And he uses the case of India versus Taiwan. And if you look at the two countries' GDP per capita in 1950, it would have been virtually identical. It was,
right.
Let's call it $50 a year. I don't know. It was really low. And yet, in the ensuing decades, Taiwan just took off, right? I mean, massive productivity growth, massive expansion of their economy, massive increase in GDP per capita, where India didn't. And India just flatlined for decades. So Taiwan's taken off, India's flatlining. And Baumol was really interested in, well, why was this? And what he found was that in India, a number of regulations were promulgated that basically delayed the building of new kinds of skills. So as an example, in accounting firms, they were not allowed to introduce computers because the Indian government was worried about the job loss among the file clerks who were handling all the paper.
Fascinating.
Yeah, isn't it? I mean, just so interesting. Plus, they weren't exporting. You know, they insisted on building domestic capability before they knew anything. So, you know, the economy was just very, very constrained. But I think what your topic is getting at is, at what point do we make the decision between which skills we need to build that are future appropriate and which ones, you know, are going to go the way of the buggy whips or the file clerks or whatever? And I think it's not always obvious in the early stages, especially when we've got all the incentives, as you pointed out, to use all this great productivity generating technology. I mean, you know, yeah. What do you do with your doctoral students? What do you do with that intern, you know, that you don't need anymore? I was joking the other day with somebody who works at a very slick PR/advertising agency, and they're totally freaked out at what AI is likely to do to their industry, right? Because if you think about it, a lot of that stuff is pretty routine. I mean, if you think about writing press release, right? I mean, AI does a great job at writing press releases, but if you think about it, who in an agency writes press releases? It's like the intern. And so the AI is probably going to do a better job than the intern. But where's the intern going to learn to be able to eventually write more report and then eventually get into more advanced copy and then eventually build skill at that? So I think it's a really interesting kind of conundrum, you know, when you think about which jobs are likely to be displaced.
Right. And I agree with you. It is really not obvious at ground zero when a new general purpose technology washes up on our shores. In particular, you can look back at a few of those hitting the economy, say electrification and the internet and what have you. The first, I'd say conservatively 10 years, maybe 8 years of each of those waves, no one had any idea what was going to happen. There was a lot of diffuse and differently directed experimentation going on, a lot of waste and harm, by the way, that we don't really study well. But you would expect and predict that most organizations trying out AI these days are mostly going to waste a lot of time and effort pursuing uncertain goals with an uncertain tool that is not fit to purpose. And so some firms will figure stuff out sooner. Some individuals will figure stuff out sooner. But this is how this at a local sort of firm or individual based level, this is very uncertain, stressful, and scary and painful. However, the human species is, if you step back and look at the planet, it is an extraordinarily efficient mechanism for our species to figure out what the heck is going on next. You need a lot of diffuse experimentation with different value sets, different technology, different tooling, different occupations, different industries, and so on. And eventually we figure it out is basically the pattern in the past. What has got me worried that this time seems different is that the pace of change and the extension of an expert's capability is so dramatic that there's, as you say, you know, the publicity. There's literally the space for a novice to participate in the work meaningfully now is zero. There's no required role for that person anymore. The sort of the rungs on the ladder, the bottom couple rungs on the ladder, are not meaningfully present. And this is not just in sort of knowledge work, HR or PR. I'm talking to software development leaders in the top tech firms on the planet, the ones making these models. And they're all forwarding amongst each other until they heard about me, an article like it's going around like wildfire called The Death of the Junior Developer, written by somebody whose hunch was like, I'm looking at my context and seeing that a junior person can no longer meaningfully contribute to the code base because they're going to contribute terrible code that works. And because they don't understand the broader system that they're contributing to, you need more skill to contribute now to the system than you reasonably have as you enter. And helping them see those problems is going to slow me down. And so I'm just going to go be productive for our firm, because with these tools, I'm 10x more productive. What does the firm want? So you're asking individuals, firms, economies to sacrifice this incredible boon of productivity now, uncertain, some will waste time and so on, at the expense of what? Just having an annoying newbie in the room? Like it's a very hard circle to square. I think it's more urgent now. This is why I wrote the book. This is why I'm trying to make as much noise about it as I am, because we have been able to progress through all of those transitions in the past because you always needed extra hands to get the job done. That PR person that you were referring to, if you ask them how they built their skill, it was, go get this pitch book for this thing. It's in the file over there. And you have to spend 2 hours looking through a set of file cabinets, and you have to read 10 other reports to find the one that you were going to find. And that's how you learn. That's your exposure to complexity. And you can come back and put that pitch deck in front of that person and say, this one has some problems in it. How do you know that? It's because you read 9 others. So that kind of opportunity is what is, I think, under threat. And I'm not naive. I'm not, you mentioned talking about solutions, and I think we should. There are circumstances where it is not, the skill is no longer going to be needed. So you shouldn't fight to preserve all of them. And involving novices is not always business appropriate, even if it would help their skill. That's fine. But I know from my own research and now my own work starting a company in this space that there are absolutely huge opportunities to get more of both productivity and skill through new work designs than would be possible otherwise. We sort of take this short-run productivity gain and assume that's the best possible, when in fact, if you just reconfigured the work and made a different kind of arrangement, then everyone could learn better and productivity would soar even higher. Bomb disposal is the example that I studied myself, where this is evident. The previous practice of bomb disposal would involve a senior bomb tech walking up to a bomb and poking it with the stick, basically. An IED. I'm kidding around, but their apprentice trying to learn that was 300 meters away in a bomb-proof truck. It's very hard for them to learn from that person on the job during the task. They don't have a video feed, they have an audio feed, but that person's not going to be talking a heck of a lot while they're toying around with a potential explosive device. The new practice, which involves a robot, which should make things worse, right? If you've followed along with this until now, in fact, is dramatically better, because now they're both in that bomb-proof truck. The apprentice has the controls of that robot in their hand, and the senior person is narrating them through how to approach the problem by driving the robot. So they learn much better than they did before. It's much safer, much more cost efficient. You get a win-win. So we're just not looking for those kind of win-wins enough. They are feasible. Some of it has to do with the design of the tech, but you could have just as well given those controls to the senior person. So there's some organizational and institutional choices there around, like, how should this work be designed, that can affect things too.
Well, and you talk about discovery, development, and deployment. And one of the examples that I thought was fascinating, because it wasn't that the manufacturer didn't build it right, it's that the organization didn't deploy it properly. And this is the case of the hospitals with the robotic devices that actually have room for an apprentice to mimic the controls, but they don't use them. And I thought that was so interesting, because we see that so often. Like the tech is designed in a way that could allow for lots of good organizational outcomes to occur, but then when it's actually rolled out, it's not deployed in the way that would maximize what it was built to do.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and very concretely, I mentioned before this robot that I studied has 4 surgical arms. One of them has your camera on it, so that allows you to see. There's 3 other arms, and the in response to surgeon request for features to help with teaching, because it was really hard to give the junior resident a chance to work, they built a second console called a training console. So it's like having 2 steering wheels and 2 gas pedals and brake pedals for the same vehicle.
Mhm.
And you digitally could swap those between, which one actually moved the robot from those consoles. But in fact, you could divvy the responsibility up in a much more piecewise fashion. So I could give an apprentice control of this arm over here while I controlled these 2 arms over here. So we could jointly be operating just as you would in the old-fashioned way, sort of. I mean, it's not at all the same. Never done.
Mhm.
Simply never done.
Mhm.
It's annoying and it's irritating. It's just like in, say, driver's ed, to be a driver's ed instructor where you have the brake pedal and the student has the gas. It's very hard to both be productive in getting somewhere and train the person. And you've got a patient's life on the line.
Mhm.
But if surgeons took that seriously, they would have developed practices and features and data collection methods to motivate and incent this kind of cooperative behavior. And who is to say there's not a way to be more efficient operating that way than there is if one person's in control?
Mhm. Well, we
It's
haven't tried it much, right? So,
ever.
for those of you that are sort of catching up with us just now, my guest is Matt Beane, and his wonderful book is called The Skill Code, and it really has to do with how humans learn, particularly at work, but I think more generally in life. I mean, I think one of the things you do mention in the book, which I really love, is that using AI, a productive way of using AI, is you can have twins, you can have copies of real life situations and let a novice actually experience that situation without doing harm. It's kind of like a flight simulator for skills. And I think we should really give serious thought to more and more of that. I mean, an example that I've been studying lately is how Kraft Heinz is thinking about redesigning its supply chain. So what they're trying to do is create like a digital twin of their whole supply chain. And one of the really interesting things to me that they're doing is, so that data comes into that system from the real world. It says, hey, this truck failed to make XYZ delivery. And then what the digital twin does is it runs through every possible system-wide response that it could summon to that situation. So do I slow production? Do I increase production? Do I shift the line to something else? Blah, 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 all these things that no human being could possibly do. And then what it spits back is its best recommendation out of all those simulated possible things. So the skill of figuring out whether to open or shut a warehouse in response to a signal, that's less important. But the ability to sort of say, okay, we're going to either accept or whoa, I'm not sure the machine has this right because there's this other factor it didn't take into account. And that kind of deep judgment, I think, is hard. I mean, it's hard to develop that unless you really got exposure to the actual situation.
Right, exactly right. And I think this is in the last chapter of the book,
Mhm.
basically, or last chapter and a half. You're preaching to the choir in terms of the huge option that we now have to enhance and deepen skill development because of the very tools that are sort of at the core of the insult right now. So that digital twin system that you're mentioning at Kraft Heinz, you can just get the output from that system and put it to use or interrogate it. If you've got the expertise already, that's okay, because you can tell, the system really isn't taking into account weather or some variable about.
Mm-hmm.
But what about designing a part of that loop to include novices in the decision-making or information flow process in a way that doesn't even tax that decision maker, so that they can at least see how the system operates, what kinds of decisions it's proposing, and then to see the decision of the expert and their rationale for why they contravened the system or went with it, like a quick note. You can just watch that, right? And so you can and you might even participate by sending in some feedback like, oh, this was interesting, or I had some questions about this, like annotating that expert's collaborative journey with that system to make a decision. We have excellent research that if you look at a recorded piece of work or, basically the written word, a bunch of different kinds of ways of codifying work, and you go through it and you annotate where you have questions and so on. It's just like taking notes in your textbook. You build much more knowledge and skill. And if you could then submit that to an AI that would give you feedback on that, but also then send a report on your analysis of that situation to that expert or manager, then their AI could digest that and say, hey, by the way, did you know that Rita, by the way, did you know Matt has been analyzing your decision making using this digital twin, and he has some really interesting points to make and some questions for you. Could you take 10 minutes and meet with him? And then we are set up for a meeting. There's no human who could do that kind of fine-grained learning coordination to match us together at just the right moment where I could learn from you with a real example in hand that you had of your own work that you had just done with some smart questions. Humans are lousy at coordinating that kind of thing, but that's all the technology required for a solution like that is on the table right now.
I think that's brilliant. So wow, this time has flown. So obviously people can get the book. The book's called Skill Code. Lots of great stuff. You can see I've got like little dog ears all through it. So how can people learn more? How can they get smarter about this? Because I think collectively we know we want to build the next generation. We know we want to, mentor people. I mean, in our heads, that's all great. But in the here and now, oh, geez, I have to take another hour and meet with the intern. I totally relate. It's a balance, right? It's a trade-off. But how do people learn more? How do you see this unfolding?
Right. Well, so a couple quick thoughts there. So one, if the conversation resonated and you want to learn more, I would just go to the skillcodebook.com, and there's a bunch of resources there that go beyond the book. So for instance, I have a Substack where I've sort of been writing new book chapters after the book was published and throwing them in there that sort of expand and extend upon the messages in the book, mostly focused on generative AI because that's where I'm focused these days. I'll just say that I've decided in the last, say, year and a half or so that the best use of my time, maybe the most valuable thing that the world really needs to deal with this problem, is to create a new metric that organizations can deploy cost effectively to measure and to show the productivity gains or losses they're getting from some new form of intelligent automation, but also how changes to the work design are liable to affect the skills of the people embedded in that workflow. So it's a joint optimization question mathematically. Like you could get a very high productivity score and a de-skilling result, right? And so if you're interested in and I'm working with a team. I mentioned I'm starting a company. We're just now deploying this metric with a few early customers. So I think until the problem is legible and we have data to show the trade space between these two things, it's just going to be coffee table talk for many people. And there'll be anecdotes and concern, but it won't be actionable for most organizations. And so if that topic of a metric is of interest, I'm doing academic research on that front in partnership with OpenAI and a research team there, but also trying to build that metric so that it's commercially available. Then you can go to mattbeane.com and get in touch with me there to learn more.
That's great. I'm reminded of a conversation I had with Peter Cappelli, who's an HR expert at Wharton.
Sure.
And he often gets asked the question, he often asks the question of corporate leaders, so do you know the price of turnover in your organization? Do you understand the cost of having to constantly replace people and bring them on board? And they don't measure that stuff. And so you end up with, as Zeynep Ton, who we mentioned earlier, author of two great books. One is called The Good Job Strategy. The other one is called The Case for Good Jobs. And she empirically shows that this stuff is enormously costly, and yet we don't measure it, so we don't see it. What we see is, head count per unit of output achieved. What we don't see is, the unit of output achieved could be much better if the head count didn't keep revolving, and those kinds of questions. So I love the thought that you're building a metric. Well, Matt Beane, thank you so much for spending the time. I hope people hear your message. I think it's a very compelling case that you're building, and I do worry. I worry that the short-term productivity bump will mask the longer-term hollowing out of a lot of these very human skills.
Yeah, in my view, thank you. That's very kind. Like I said, I was delighted to be here. The firms and individuals that figure this out, this problem, and act on it decisively, to seize both productivity and skill development. It will be hard, but they will win. It is very obvious to me, just like firms that manage turnover in a healthy way and so on. The research is really clear there, I think. So in general, we should expect most won't. The forces are very strong, sucking us towards productivity. But if you seize on this moment and pursue both goals simultaneously, you have a really good shot at coming out way ahead coming in the next chapter.
Well, thank you for that message. And good luck. Think about that over the weekend, everyone. See you soon.
Take care. Thank you very much.